know that President Trump and the First Lady look forward to their trip to China. I don't have any specific dates or times to read out at this point, but I know the White House will look forward to providing a schedule just as soon as they can.
It has been confirmed that Donald Trump will visit China in November. The 100 days plan was agreed by both sides after President Xi Jinping's visit to the U.S. in April, aiming to narrow the deficit in Sino-U.S. trade. What can we expect from the meeting in China? It seems that sanctions on the DPRK have still been ineffective since September 15th saw another launch of a ballistic missile. Will Trump's visit to China bring new solutions to the situation in the Korean Peninsula? China's trade surplus with the U.S. has increased by 6.5% this year. What will Trump's next move be in his attempt to narrow the gap? And Trump recently decided to stop an acquisition of an American semiconductor company by a Chinese company in the name of national security. What's the connection?
U.S. President Donald Trump will make his first visit to China in November this year. With a series of issues to be dealt with, will he choose to upgrade the bilateral relationship between the two biggest economies, or is there a possibility of a trade war? What's the current state of the China-U.S. relationship and where is it headed? To preview Donald Trump's trip to China, I'm happy to be joined in the studio in the first half by Dr. Su Ge, President of the China Institute of International Studies, and Rick Dunham, visiting scholar at Tsinghua University. In the second half, we shall have Dr. Jay Huang, a founding partner of Jadestone Capital, with us on the current economic status quo between China and the U.S. We shall also speak to Robert Cab, director of the Economist Corporate Network via satellite. He's based in Hong Kong. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Gentlemen, the presidency of Donald Trump was described as unpredictable, particularly right after he took office. Now, many months have passed. What do you think of the predictability of his agenda? Or does he actually have an agenda on China, for example?
Well, that's hard to say. Probably the best person to answer this is Donald Trump himself. But from our viewpoint, when we observe what has been going on, it seems that when Donald Trump came to the White House, and there had been a number of difficulties. And after he has been in the White House, and President Xi Jinping and Donald Trump met twice, one in Mar-a-Lago, the other at Hamburg, Germany. And they have had a number of telephone calls, probably over 6. There's another one coming up. After all these contacts, it seems that these two leaders have brought about more understandings among each other. And President Xi Jinping said that we have 1,000 reasons to expect a good China-U.S. relationship. And President Donald Trump have said that he and President Xi Jinping have had very good chemistry with each other. So he's coming, President Trump is invited to come at the invitation of President Xi Jinping to come for a state visit in China in November. So I'm sure that he will be welcome.
Rick, Mr. Donald Trump was the host of Apprentice. He never had any serious political experiences before winning the campaign. But ever since the campaign trail, he's been surrounded by a team of unfriendly, if not hostile, advisors about the issue of China. Now, with the ouster of Steve Bannon, the senior strategic advisor to the presidency of Donald Trump, do you think the bilateral relationship between the two biggest economies is most likely to get a lot better?
Well, it can't get worse as far as Bannon is concerned. Steve Bannon was the #1 loudest, harshest China critic inside the White House. And so not having him in the meetings makes a big difference in the relationship. But I think you hit the nail right on the head when you talked about The Apprentice. The Trump White House has been like The Apprentice. Somebody gets fired each week. I mean, it's been a revolving door.
And a lot of vacancies yet to be filled, government posts.
Including in the State Department, where foreign policy is made. The issues that you have with the Trump White House that are consistent the Trump vision of the U.S.-China relationship, but there's been no noticeable strategy. What we've seen is a tweet here, a tweet there. The only important positive that has developed is the personal relationship between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. Donald Trump is very much a one-on-one business person. He likes people, he doesn't like people. He doesn't like the Chancellor of Germany for some reason and the Prime Minister of Australia. He likes Xi Jinping. He trusts Xi Jinping. And so you have to say that's a good first step in building a relationship, even if the president himself is inconsistent from day to day when he pushes the keys on the Twitter.
Well, what do you think of the conflicting signals that Mr. Bannon delivered during his recent visit to Hong Kong? He was invited by a group of Chinese business executives in this territory, and he seemed to be pretty inconsistent about the China policy. What do you think of
I think
his presentation there?
What I will say is he was being paid, and he did not insult his hosts. I mean, if he had spoken in Hong Kong and said the United States is going to be at war with China in 10 years, like he wrote before he joined the White House.
Hey, come on, he's a human. He needs to be treated nicely in part of our public relations campaigns.
Right. Well, he was paid. I mean, he was paid well, and he did not insult his hosts. I think it was a very interesting speech because there were messages where, if you read between the lines, you can see where the tension could be between Donald Trump and the Chinese government on trade. But also, to me, it was important that, as far as reading between the lines of his speech, he toned down some of the foreign policy hostility.
But what about the appointment of General Kelly as the Chief of Staff? Do you think the transparency and the predictability of Donald Trump's presidency would be a lot better, given the possibility that General Kelly would be able to manage his use of tweets and even his family relationship with Ivanka and Kushner?
Well, you are talking about the president's man. Then you have a president, and then the others are his assistants and the people. Although these people, they have high social status and very important positions, but the person they serve is the President of the United States. So my personal opinion is that no matter who gets that position, so President Trump, it's outside forces, it's very hard for them to change Donald Trump.
Well, I mean, I think that General Kelly has done an admirable job of trying to keep the White House organized. It was just chaos under Reince Priebus. And people were walking into the White House, people were dropping off articles on the president's desk, people were calling him on his cell phone. That's under control, which is better for policy making. You can have policy making without mad bombers coming in and disrupting the logical policy progression. What Chief of Staff Kelly cannot control is the Twitter. He can't control the president on his own time. In the morning when he wakes up and looks at TV news and decides to tweet, when he has dinner with his family, when he watches TV at night and then starts tweeting again. That's what General Kelly can't control. And then sometimes they have to walk back what the president tweets or ask the president, is this the new policy of the U.S. government the next day?
Well, Bannon was very honest about the American policy on the DPRK. He said something like military intervention was not the option on the table. Does it mean that the United States would bet the future of the Korean Peninsula on China, which is described by Western media as the closest ally of the DPRK? But to what degree do you think China will exercise its influence?
Well, for President Trump's visit, on China's part, lots to be expected, I think he's going to have his agenda. He's going to focus on economic relations, trade, and then foreign relations. So our prediction is that he's going to focus on DPRK. Well, with that in mind, let me just say that DPRK issue is a quandary. It has been left. It's combined by both the hot and the cold wars. It has not been solved. It was not solved in the last few decades. It takes time. I think that China's position is three-pronged, and that is denuclearization period in the first place, and peace and stability for the region. That suits the interests of both China and United States and international community, and then how to realize this end, we need to go through diplomatic and peaceful means. For the United States, President Trump and the White House and the State Department have sent out mixed messages and sometimes conflicting messages. So we are carrying out the resolution by the United Nations Security Council 2375 resolutely in all comprehensively. But the resolution says that we should not only give sanctions on North Korea. That's one thing. At the same time, it calls for six-party efforts to resume the six-party talks. So we hope that the United States, when you say that all options are on the table, so when you make the final next step, have to think about the consequences and take everything into consideration.
What do you think of the very close strategic consultation between Russia and China on whatever regional or global issues? If you look at how Pakistan has tried to seek help from Moscow and why Russia and China joined hand in saying no to a comprehensive suspension of the oil supply to the DPRK.
Well, at this point, I think Russia is driving a good deal of what's going on in Korea with sanctions because Russia said no. I mean, Russia at first was not going to approve a new resolution, and I think it tempered the resolution. They were sort of the bad cops, with Donald Trump being on the other side, calling for a complete suspension of oil exports. But I think Russia is a key player here, but the relationship between Putin and Trump is actually more complicated than Xi Jinping and Trump. So I'm not sure where it goes in a three-way relationship.
Very quickly, I'd like to know your thoughts on whether President Trump will visit Manila, given the new policy of President Duterte on the South China Sea. He's adopted a very constructive policy towards China and about the joint exploration of the maritime resources in China Sea instead of turning to a confrontational approach.
So we will remain and see. Sources from Washington, D.C. have indicated that President Trump is not only going to visit China, and he's considering visit Japan and Korea. And there will be two international regional conferences being held, one in Manila, the other in Vietnam, the APEC conference also. So the U.S. president probably is thinking of attending one or both of them.
And your hunch?
I would say Vietnam is most likely. Vietnam and U.S. have developed strong bilateral ties. Yeah. In terms of Philippines, I don't think that Duterte himself would be the problem. I think the biggest problem there is that Donald Trump hates large gatherings of leaders where he's not the most important person. and so that would be I think that would be the argument against it.
No problem. President Xi Jinping will definitely give him a red carpet ceremony and a lot of photo opportunities. Thank you so much for being with us. With that, we come to the end of the first part of our discussion about the U.S.-China relationship ahead of President Trump's official visit to China, the first of its kind, but the tour also will take him to Japan and South Korea, the two allies in Asia. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this short break. Welcome to the second half of our program. We are happy to be joined here by Jay Huang, founding chairman of Jaystone Capital. He's going to discuss with us trade relationship between China and the United States. Welcome to Dialogue, Jay. During the first 8 months of 2017, it seems China's trade surplus with the United States has increased by 6.5%. That means automatically that the trade deficit on the U.S. side has suffered a lot. What do you think of the first 100 days between the two biggest economies as scheduled by President Xi Jinping during the Mar-a-Lago summit, the first of its kind in California, to sort of proactively improve the strained relationship in those days?
I think both countries' economy has been doing quite well. In the U.S., I think their GDP growth has been quite good. And the latest number I noticed is around close to 3% for the last quarter. And in China, it looks like China's economy has been stabilized and also quite strong, around like 6%. I think both countries are doing quite well, despite of some trade surplus issues. That's all my understanding is, depending on which status statistics and you're using, it could be higher and lower. But by and large, it looks like both countries benefit from this trade.
It's certainly not like the situation of when we go high, they go low. Trade
right.
issues are not that simple. Let me go to Robert Kapp for his analysis on the alleged imbalance in U.S.-China relationship. I mean, the trade relationship. Robert, what do you think of the first 100 days? What do you think will be the deliverables on the agenda of President Donald Trump when he does come in November?
Well, I think he's going to try to move beyond what was decided in Mar-a-Lago, which was actually really just to get the two leaders together, it seems, and to agree on some rather small-scale objectives. They opened up markets in terms of beef and chicken, and they provided more financial market access for U.S. institutions. But I think what's going to be very key going forward, of course, is the big issue that's now fascinating the world, and that is North Korea. And China and the U.S., specifically Donald Trump, representing the new U.S. view of the world from the White House, has a very different view on how to handle North Korea from Beijing. And I think that'll be the most interesting point of discussion.
But apparently, President Trump is very anxious and has placed China under Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act. And that means they're going to start a trade war if China refuses to cooperate with the United States on the issue of the DPRK, and particularly opening up our market for the government procurement program. What do you think of their concerns?
I think if you ask me whether there is a real risk about full-scale trade war, I would say the risk is very low, because you look at China and the U.S., the economy, both countries are so much interdependent of each other. So I doubt that there will be real risk of full scale of the trade war. That's my personal opinion. But of course, and that there are some issues on the trade, and that's, we'll have to deal with it case by case. I think that right now, I think China and the U.S. are moving towards the right direction. And some of the issues and the U.S. delegation put on the table has been addressed by the Chinese side.
Generally, we are in the correct direction. However, what do you think of the area of semiconductor? And China seems to be so dependent on our imports from Western markets, and yet the latest presidential decree from the White House says no and rejects an offer by the Chinese company in the United States to buy Lattice, that is an American-based chip company. What do you think of the implications?
I think we'll have to put things into perspective. China spent more money importing semiconductor chips than importing oil. For example, in 2015, China spent about $150 billion on importing oil, but it spent over $230 billion on importing chips. And also this so-called self-sufficient rate, which means amount of semiconductor chips China consumed, out of that, how much is a China domestic company really supplies? That self-sufficient rate is lower than 20%. So naturally, China want to correct this imbalance, want to get more development on the semiconductor side of it. I think that's natural, reasonable, and legitimate. I think that this is should be welcomed by the U.S. side. In terms of this blocked deal, I think the U.S. has been criticizing China for intellectual property protection, violation. And China, to buy this company a lot, is actually try to acquire their IP. So this is the right way to protect the U.S. company's IP. So I think this should not be blocked, and that should be beneficial for both sides.
Let me go to Robert for his thoughts on whether it is a wise policy option for Beijing to have a trade-off. For example, we give you more market shares. In return, Western economies should reciprocate this with high-tech transfer. However, the United States says no to such a technological transfer, citing national security as the reason. What do you think of the U.S. concerns?
Well, I think what you outlined there, Young Ray, is a basically sound approach. I mean, I think the operative word is reciprocal. The U.S. and China both have national security concerns. They both say, I need to protect some aspects of my economy from your investments and from your market entry. I don't think we're going to get fundamentally beyond that anytime soon, but a great first step would be, I think, and this would be the source of a potential breakthrough, because I don't see a lot of pragmatic proposals, let's just say, in terms of U.S.-China trade from Washington. But if Beijing could say, look, let's do something reciprocal. You know, I'll open up more to you, you open up more to me. I think that's a great basis for going forward. I don't know if that would save the lattice semiconductor deal, but it could open up some very key markets and then hopefully get that trade imbalance back to a proper state of equilibrium.
Given the dynamics of the Chinese economic recovery in recent months, many in China show signs of being optimistic about the economic prospects, such as in the year 2030, China is likely to surpass the U.S. economy and becomes the biggest economy in the world. Does it mean more market shares for the U.S. companies, and therefore it is unwise for the American authorities to impose any investigations such as anti-dumping investigations or anti-subsidy investigations? Because the United States still refuses to grant China the full-fledged market economic status. Robert?
Oh, well, in terms of the market economic status, I mean, what you were illustrating there with China's growth trajectory and the size of its market, that and market economic qualification are actually two different things. One is describing a large market. The other is describing a market that gives access to many participants from all around the world. So put it this way, I think the U.S. would be wise to try to engage China constructively. I think there's been a lot of negative sentiment. Beijing is definitely feeling that. Some of your commentators on tonight's program have been reflecting that. At the same time, from an American viewpoint, and I'm not just taking the White House side on this, but I will say America looks at China and it sees it very closed. And until China can demonstrate, no, I'm truly an open market, I really am giving your companies a chance to grow through my growth, then I think it'll have a much better argument, and it could go after both the U.S. and the EU, which is also debating the part of China's status as a market economy. It would have much more moral authority for saying, you need to give me that status and let's all grow together.
President Xi Jinping did send a very powerful message during his stay in Davos, outlining our confidence about further globalization and free trade. Having said this, our Western observers would always focus on the issue of IPR protection, because we've been talking about more transfer of high technology. However, do you think China is ready to protect intellectual property rights?
I think so. Before I'm addressing that, at the beginning of this year, China State Council issued a circular number 5, which is checking on China's commitment during the WTO side to truly open up China's market. I think China's government has been very serious in delivering that commitment. I see a lot of positive actions among the central government, even provincial government. I think the government intention to truly open up, fully commit, and WTO commitment is real. Going back to the IPR protection, I think it's a time actually for China to seriously looking into that, because we're in the high-tech investment firm. When we invest into a Chinese company, we found out that their number one concern is actually their IP get stolen by their counterpart within China. So as you can see, the IP protection is not just say protect international companies, the IP right in China, and also protect the Chinese innovators, their property right within China. I think this is a benefit not just for foreign companies, but also for Chinese domestic and innovator as well. So I think it's the time for China to really take action to protect IP.
Robert, what do you think of China's pressures to protect, what do you think of Chinese measures to protect intellectual property rights?
Well, as was just being mentioned, I totally agree with that. I think what's been happening, and many of us had anticipated a number of years ago when China seemed to be such a flagrant violator of international IPR norms, was that once China started having its own intellectual property, then it would start to get serious. And that does seem to be happening. I think that's a good sign of progress. But I think it really does mean you have to be equally applicable in the regulations. That means, yes, you protect Chinese intellectual property, but you do respect global intellectual property. And there is something to the Washington argument that you're making our companies transfer intellectual property to you when you should let them come in and compete. That, for example, would give a great opening if China allowed that of American companies, for, say, Huawei maybe to get into the U.S. There's some other issues there, but that, again, could be a good first step.
One more question for Robert. What do you think of the response from AmCham, which used to be and has been a strong lobby group to defend U.S.-China relationship? Whenever there were troubles, it is AmCham that would first stand out and say, look, we got to take a holistic picture about the interdependence. What do you think of their response to the latest challenges in this relationship?
Well, one of the things they've been promoting recently is the notion of reciprocal trade as a basis for future negotiations, meaning instead of just the promise of eventually giving U.S. companies access, China really needs to start doing it now, and then therefore the U.S. wouldn't have any reasons for imposing tariffs and so forth. But going back to your original point about holistic views, I personally support that. I think they should support that too. I think that having more true reciprocity in trade actually conceptually makes a lot of sense. It shouldn't happen that we get too project specific, which is what this has devolved into. That's why they have the Super 301 potential regulation coming on board now under Trump, because they're afraid that this area of forced technology transfer requires remedial action. If we could just have a more broad trade platform that is truly mutually beneficial, we could get beyond those sort of specific case litigations.
Not only is vision badly needed on the side of Donald Trump, but also we got to be very careful about his relevance and relationship that he tries to build between the DPRK and our U.S.-China trade. He wants China to do more to punish the regime in North Korea. Well, that's obviously an issue of geoeconomics, very complicated. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.